Okay, we're going to Monsieur, who's taking a picture back there, and Rob Martini, who can't be here. He's we organize this weekly seminar, and this is actually our last of the academic year, and we saved some of the best for last. But before I get too much in an introduction, I need to do our usual reminder about these microphones that are sitting in most of you, but not all of you. We do webcast seminar, so some people do watch live on the web, and then we archive it on the web so people can watch it later on. And to make sure that people watching on the web can hear the question that you ask, please use the microphone, hold the touch area with the red light on while you're speaking, so everyone can hear you. And we do have people watch on the web. I can do that. So without further I guess I'll introduce the speaker now, but what I also want to do is just quickly go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves, because we sort of get a different crowd here each week, and I think it would be good to know who's joining us today. So just your name and your affiliation. And so that I don't necessarily come up again, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Sandy as well. So today our speaker is sponsored by the Oregon Department of Transportation's Visiting Scholar Program. And we have today Sandy Rosenbloom, who's a professor of planning at the University of Arizona and has done extensive work in the area of transportation and travel behavior in many areas, and today she's going to be focusing on aging community. And so now we will start right here in the front with who you are and where you're.
I'm John Sway, and I'm a first-year urban and regional planning student.
I am Haruguna Mariam with CHTM.
I'm Teresa Carr with CH2M Hill.
I'm Chad Terria with the Institute on Aging.
Carolyn Gathaway from ODOT, and we're working on the Oregon Transportation Plan, which has as part of a component like involving aging.
Michael Rock, also with the Oregon Department of Transportation.
Jennifer Dill, PSU.
Zach Horowitz, first-year Masters of Civil Engineering student.
Chris Monsieur, faculty member, Civil and Environmental Engineering.
Amin Wahab, I work for the City of Portland.
Ali Al-Hawai, I'm a graduate student at Civil Engineering.
I'm Beth Kutz, I'm on the faculty with the Institute on Aging.
Nancy Chapman, faculty from Urban Studies and Planning.
Arzu Movahed, also from the Institute on Aging.
Kathleen Kincaid, undergraduate student in Environmental Studies at Portland State.
Jim Strathman, Center for Urban Studies.
Claire Potter from TriMet.
Susan Storm from TriMet.
Jerry Milner, faculty member, Urban Studies and Planning.
Lauren Lutzenheiser, faculty, Urban Studies, Planning.
Chen Tai, faculty at Population Research Center.
Marjorie Halford, Committee on Accessible Transportation with TriMet.
I'm Lily Fitzpatrick. I'm the chair of the Transportation Committee of Southwest Neighborhoods, Inc.
Dave Vargas, retired civil engineer and Oregon Tech faculty member.
Patty Fink, TriMet.
Lavinia Gordon, Portland Office of Transportation.
Casey Nolan, graduate student, Urban Studies.
Alan Delatorre, graduate student, Gerontology and Planning and Urban Studies.
Tim DuBois, senior student here in Civil Engineering.
Barbara Blackstone, Oregon Consensus Program, Land Use Mediation.
I wonder if you remember, we went to graduate school together at UCLA. Remember? I went, yeah, remember remember Bynum Campbell, the transportation program there? Good to see you.
Hey, wait a minute. I thought it was the other way around.
Ethan Seltzer, School of Urban Studies and Planning.
Larry Wallach, Dean of the College of Urban and Public Affairs.
Scott Gates from Metropolitan Family Service.
Susan Tingley with Ride Connection.
Philip Ross, senior student with the communication department, and an hour and 20 minutes away from finishing my coursework.
Suman Tasneem, graduate student in civil and environmental engineering.
Joyce, Master of Science in Civil Engineering.
More than annoyed that planners do not really respond to or consider the needs of older people in almost anything they do. You're very unusual in having a gerontology component of your urban studies program. That's very unusual. Mostly these things are totally ignored in urban studies programs, totally ignored in planning programs. And I want to talk about why I think that is, why I think it's wrong, and just give a general idea of the areas in which I think planners and I believe civil engineers ought to be working in conjunction, of course, with some of the folks who are here who are gerontologists. Now, I don't let you guys totally off the hook. I think the gerontologists are in part of the problem, but certainly one of the first things we need to do is all get in the same space, and then we can spend a little more time talking about how to work together. Let me talk about why I think people who are planners, and I believe also civil engineers, should be concerned with the needs of older people. First of all, it seems to escape people's notice that the elderly are a large and growing component of the population. Today, they're about little under 13% of the population, that is, people over 65, are about 13% of the population, but within just a few decades, they're going to be 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 in some places. Secondly, planners and civil engineers and others that are concerned with the community need to be concerned about the elderly, because the elderly actually are a significant cause or part of the cause of some of our problems. Now, I know some folks say to me, oh my God, we don't have enough problems, now you want to blame other things on us? But I actually think politically it's actually an important component of solving these problems, and it might get the right people's attention if they recognize how much the elderly are involved in and suffer disproportionately from a host of urban and community problems that planners and civil engineers generally address. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on demographic data because I think the majority of you in this room know that. But what may come as a surprise to some of you is some of the other demographic features. I've talked about the percentage of the population that's older, and I'm going to give you just a few examples of that. But I think there's a belief that all older people live in the downtowns of urban areas, or it turns out that over 75% of older people either live in the suburbs or in rural areas. And though there are folks in the centers of urban areas and deserve our attention as well, increasingly the problem of aging is the problem of suburbia. And so all the problems of suburbia both are caused by and impact on older people. Then there's a huge problem for states. Rural states are increasingly elderly, have a much higher percentage of the elderly population, usually trapped in declining farm and mining communities where all the young people have moved out. It's not that older people are moving into these communities, it's that they're the ones left behind by the migration out of younger people. And then there are the states where older folks are migrating at or near retirement, Florida, Arizona, almost all the warm states, but some of the cold ones as well. the bottom of this one is chopped off, but this is a typical population pyramid. It's called, and it's from the U.S. in 1950. It's called a pyramid, as many of you know, because in traditional societies there were more young people than older people, so you got that pyramid problem. Does anybody know why you've got that at near the bottom? Why you've got those indents? That's the result of the Depression and the Second World War, where people didn't have as many children. But right coming after that is what? The baby boomers. Okay, the top pyramid is 2000, and the one below that is what? 2025. What you see is what's happening in every developed country around the world, the squaring of the pyramid. In fact, if you look at the population pyramids of the Scandinavian countries, they're turned on their head. That is, there's many, many, many more old people than young people. And in fact, our population is only squaring itself because we let immigrants in. In fact, the people who live here that look like the folks of Western Europe are not replacing themselves. The only reason this country has a population pyramid that is not upside down is because we let in immigrants who are both younger and tend to have more children. But almost all the European countries have now gone below replacement. They're not having enough children to replace themselves. And what are the implications of this? There's several. On a personal level, older people will have fewer and fewer younger folks to bring them services, to help them out. And on a societal level, there'll be fewer and fewer younger workers paying the taxes that will pay for the services for those people at the top of what used to be a pyramid. Said older people live in the suburbs. This is by cohort, but what you need to do is not assume that as people get older, they're more likely to live in the central city. You have to see the movement from left to right. That cohort that's 55 to 59 on the left side of the chart, that's what's going to be happening. You're going to have very few people living in the central city. You're going to have most folks living in the suburbs. And someone did a study, Jen Giuliano at the University of Southern California did a study of folks who do live in the central city and found that the elderly people who live in the central city, only 9% live at what you would call high density. And that's because they're using the census definition. So if you live within the city boundaries of Tampa, Florida, which crosses 4 counties, you're considered to be living in the central city even if you're living on a 3-acre farm, which can happen. So what we see is the majority of older people are living in low-density places where they, depend on the car, where it's hard to bring them services when they can't drive, where it's practically impossible to provide public transportation in a meaningful way, where service delivery is very difficult. So that's the first element I wanted to talk about. The second element is the elderly's contribution to a host of problems that planners and civil engineers do consider. Now, I could talk for days about this, so I'm just going to talk briefly about each one of those. First, I want to talk about 2 interrelated things: how older folks contribute to sprawl and how they contribute to our demand for new infrastructure, transportation, housing, a whole variety of things. This is Tucson, Arizona. Now, you say, okay, Portland's nothing like Tucson, but actually a number of cities look like this. Those little red dots are active adult retirement communities. You may have heard of them talked about Del Webb's Sun City, but now many, many builders build them all across the United States, and they're also showing up. Del Webb is building in Illinois and in the so-called Four Seasons markets. But do you notice where those red dots are? They're all on the periphery of the metropolitan area, and many of them are outside of the jurisdictional boundaries of the cities involved, and they're in the county. And it may not surprise you, of the 23 or 24 active adult retirement communities here, interestingly, which span the income range. Some of those are mobile home parks, and some of those are very, very fancy retirement communities. Only one of the 23 or 24 shown here is anywhere near an existing public transit line. Moreover, think how difficult it would be to provide service on the periphery like that. Now, as I said, we've done this in other cities in the South and the Southwest. This phenomena is not unique to Tucson. But let me show you something else about Tucson just because I have the data. Between 1990 and 2000, the number of folks over 65 went up substantially, but look where it went up. Outside the city limits in the county, at the fringe of the metropolitan area. In fact, if you look at the numbers, you will see that the number of older people in Tucson in the city limits actually, the number actually went down, not just the percentage. So what's happening here? Well, William Fry did a study for the Brookings Institute, and he looked at census data for all the metropolitan areas in the United States, and he found that the older folks who move on retirement, which is a minority of older folks, most older folks age in place, but the majority of older folks who move are moving to the periphery. They're moving outside of established cities. So what are you getting? You're getting two kinds of suburban enclaves of older people. One, the majority who are aging in place. Older people are much less likely to move on retirement than their counterparts did 30 years ago, and that's directly related to home ownership. It's happening in Europe too. Folks in Europe move more on retirement, but now that there's greater home ownership, they're staying put and aging in place. Where are they aging in place? In the suburban neighborhoods they moved after the Second World War to raise their children. So they're in big houses out in low-density suburbs where there are limited services, and that kind of pattern predominates in the so-called Rust Belt. So you're getting suburbs in Cleveland, in Indianapolis, in Boston, suburbs full of older people who are aging in place. Now, of course, not all suburbs, I mentioned Boston, not all suburbs are poorly served, but a lot of them are. The second way you're getting suburban growth of elderly folks is those folks who are moving. Well, I just said that fewer folks are moving. Yes, but it's a smaller percentage of a larger number, because there's so many more older people. Even though a smaller percentage are moving on retirement, that's millions and millions of people. And you know where they're going to. They're going to the Sun Belt communities and to the edges, like Tucson, like Phoenix, like Tampa, like every Florida city. In fact, some of the Florida cities fall into sort of both the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt phenomena, because migration to Florida cities has been going on for so long that you've got aging in place central city elderly as well as suburban elderly. Environmental pollution. In many ways, but the most important way is the contribution older people make by driving. Again, you need to read this chart from left to right. People do not suddenly, as they get older, stop driving. What's happening here is that you're seeing older cohorts, people from a different generation where women were so if you look at the right side of the chart, you're seeing women who are much less likely to drive, people who are much less likely to drive. If you look at those who are 65 to 69, you can see that the licensing gap between men and women has diminished greatly, and if you look at the cohort just behind that, you see that it's almost gone. In fact, if you disaggregate the data among people over 45, the difference in licensing rates is almost entirely explained by ethnicity, race, and immigration status. That is, folks who came from other countries, the women were simply less likely to be licensed to drive. Traditionally, women have not come into their 40s and 50s and decided to get a driver's license. That's not the American way. But it is increasingly for immigrants, and what's happening in licensing bureaus is they're getting a lot of folks who came from other countries, women who came from other countries who at 40 or 50 are getting driver's licenses. And so that's the kind of thing we're going to see. We're going to see a population of older people, all of whom have driven for many, many years in their lives, who have built their lives and their lifestyles on dependence on the car, on relying on the car. This shouldn't surprise you then. The elderly actually don't look that much different than younger people in their dependence on cars and their lack of dependence on public transportation and other modes. Incidentally, these are national data from the National Household Travel Survey, and this was the first of the national surveys that made a very special effort to capture walking trips. There had been a constant criticism against previous studies that they had not adequately captured walking trips, and so there were a lot of pointed questions, a lot of prompts about walking, and indeed the percentage of trips taken by walking by all people jumped up in the data, which we don't think means that people are walking more, but that we weren't capturing walking trips accurately before. But let's look at this in a little more detail, and especially in a way I like to look at it, looking at it men versus women. First of all, when they're in the car, the men are almost always driving. If they went by car, they were driving the car. Notice that at age 85 and older, almost 90% of the trips that older men are making are in a car, and they're driving two-thirds of the time. Women are different, and in an interesting and important way, which we could perhaps go into later. They are much more likely to be the passenger in the car, even if they have a driver's license. And one of the implications of that is that when they're 75 or 80 or 85 and their spouse or partner no longer drives, they are suddenly forced to drive. And sometimes they really don't have the experience, or they do, but they don't have the confidence. This is one of the reasons women give up driving earlier than men, for less obvious reasons, is because they really don't have as much driving experience as their licensing would lead you to believe. And one of the interesting questions is if new generations of older women are going to look, if I'm going to look like that when I'm 75 years old, or whether I'm going to look more like a current male driver. Environmental pollution related to this. This is the point I'm trying to make, that this dependence on driving contributes significantly. And we know that most regional and statewide transportation studies underestimate the importance of the driving patterns of older people, because they're assuming the low levels of licensing seen in the past, and they're assuming the low trip making seen in the past. But over the last 30 years, there has been a tremendous triple-digit increase in every measure of driving and travel by older people. It's hard to find any other social indicators that have gone up so rapidly. Percentage of number of trips made, miles traveled in a car, hours spent, minutes and hours spent driving. All of these things have gone up by triple digits for older people over the last 2 and 3 decades. So they are going to be they're going to contribute a significant number of the vehicle miles traveled, and thus they're going to overall contribute to all of the problems, environmental problems the car contributes. But there's worse. It's worse than that. Older folks tend to make short trips. Short trips generally do not activate the pollution control devices on cars. That's the so-called cold start problem. So even though they're making fewer trips, because largely they're no longer going to work, the trips they do make may pollute more than longer trips taken by those still in the workforce. Moreover, when they trade work trips for non-work trips, they're often trading trips that you could take by public transportation for trips that are almost impossible to make by public transportation. So the travel activities of older people will be a significant component of the environmental degradation and pollution we see contributed by the car. Let's talk about traffic congestion just briefly. Probably you know that in most major studies, traffic congestion comes out as 1 or 2 or 3 on the list of problems that people report in their community. Well, how can the elderly contribute to traffic congestion? They're not going to work. Well, no, but we have 2 things going on. They do take a substantial number of their trips in congested time periods, partially because our urban areas are gradually being a place where there is no such thing as a peak period, or there's 6 peak periods a day. There's tremendous congestion out there. There are a number of cities, including Los Angeles, Tampa, Phoenix, and I can't remember, the TTI, the Texas Transportation Institute, indicate have a higher midday peak than either the morning or the evening peak. So what does all this mean? It means that though the elderly are not out in the traditional peak periods, a significant percentage of their travel is when there is congestion on the road. And as some of you may know, older drivers tend to avoid freeways. They tend to use arterial streets more, which have lower capacity. Therefore, they are contributing to street congestion, even if they're not contributing that much to highway congestion. I'm not going to talk much about this because I really could talk for days about this. Most of you probably think that older drivers have more. How many people here think that older drivers have more crashes than younger drivers? Well, I get you know. You're wrong. Okay? They actually, on a per capita basis, till about the age of 85, have fewer crashes. That's why insurance companies charge older drivers less, not more. However, on an exposure basis, per mile driven, they do have more crashes. However, they don't have more crashes than 18 to 24-year-old boys because nobody could. So before you're going to take older drivers off the road, you're going to take those teenage drivers off the roads, or nobody's going to uphold any kind of legislation that takes older drivers off the road. But but they do have more. They do have more accidents for every mile they drive. And if, in fact, older drivers continue to drive, well, let's pretend that's not the issue. There's simply going to be more older drivers. So even if their per capita rates don't go up, we're going to see more crashes involving older drivers over the next 20, 30, 40 years. Also, because they're more frail, they die more or have serious injuries more in crashes of comparable severity, simply because they're frailer, and simply because a lot of them are women who, on top of being old and having the frailties of age, have the frailties of being a woman, which cars are not designed to address, and we can talk about that at some length. Okay, so you know about that, and you know that you've been caught behind an older driver who was driving, as far as you were concerned, too slowly, and you probably tell people that even if they're not in accidents, they're causing accidents. In fact, that's not true either. But it doesn't really make any difference because there's going to be so many older drivers that even if they become safer and safer, as they have been doing, older drivers have fewer crashes per capita or per mile today than they did 20 or 30 years ago because they're coming into their retirement years as experienced drivers with years of experience. Even if per capita rates don't change, it is an important traffic safety and public health issue because there's going to be so many older people. But let me talk just briefly about two other things. One is that older drivers are going to be an increasing percentage of the people out there on the road. They're going to be an increasing percentage of licensed drivers and an increasing percentage of people out on the road. They're not going to be out on the road as much as younger people, but they are going to be on the road more than they have been in the past. And this requires us to rethink the entire way we develop our highway systems. For example, bigger signs, better lane markings. Is there anybody here who minds having bigger signs? Do you think signs are too big? You really like them smaller? Okay, so you can see where this is going. We're going to have an increasingly mixed pool, and we have no way at this time to deal with that, and we're inadequately dealing with what we know about constraints in older drivers' driving skills, their need for different kinds of signs and different kinds of lane markings. The other issue is pedestrians. Now, as older drivers are overrepresented in fatalities in car crashes, they're substantially there are far more older people involved who are killed or injured in pedestrian incidents than their percentage of the population, even a higher share than car crashes. And traditionally, we've thought traditionally we've collected data when older people were hit by cars, basically. And increasingly in both Scandinavia and in the U.S., researchers have been using hospital admission data to look at pedestrian crashes. And what it turns out is for every pedestrian hit by a car, every older pedestrian hit by a car, there are 5 who fall in some way on the street. They stumble over garbage, they get pushed down by bicyclists. They fall on ice, they fall on they're trying to get to a transit stop and the road is poorly maintained. All of these things are very, very serious. Now remember, we're talking about data based on hospital admissions. We're not talking about people who fall and don't go to the hospital. So these are serious kinds of things. And our data systems don't collect them adequately, and that's a problem. But more importantly, it suggests that we need to approach the whole way we provide pedestrian facilities and community facilities. Now, understand, many communities and as a society, we're very concerned with the environmental problems posed by the car, so we're trying to get everybody out of their car. Well, we know that an older person is 15 times more likely to be killed or injured in a pedestrian crash than in a car crash. So we're taking them out of the safer mode. They're safer in a car than they are on the street. And if that doesn't pose a dilemma for planners and civil engineers, I don't know what does. There's significant issues here. Now, why is it the planners and, in a secondary sense, civil engineers don't look at these issues? Well, the first reason, and I'll address that in a minute, is that you don't see much work on the elderly in either planning or pedagogy. Again, you guys are the exception. If you look across the United States at planning schools and urban studies programs, you find very little about older people, very few courses, and if they're discussed as a minority fringe element. You know, they're put together with folks who have disabilities, immigrants to this country. You know, any people that we see as marginal, we shove into a 1-week section of a course. So we don't do research. Planners, and I can't think of any civil engineering research on this, do not do research on older folks in general. Then we misunderstand or misperceive the dimensions of the issue, and I've covered some of that already. And third, planners sort of assume that anything that's good for other people is good for the elderly. And we have a number of things that are very topical now, like smart growth and neo-traditional development and all of these things. And we tend to say, okay, if it's good for everybody, it's good for older people. And I want to suggest that's not true at all. The reverse is often true. It is far more often true that what's good for older people is good for everybody, but it's not necessarily true the other way around. For the Fannie Mae Foundation, I did a study, an incredibly boring study, of the content of a number of journals. And I picked the 14 leading planning journals. They were the ones reported to the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning as the ones in which people most often published. And I also looked at 24 journals dealing with gerontology. But here, I'm going to let the gerontologists off and just talk about the planners. Less than 5% of any of the articles published in the leading planning journals dealt with any aspect of aging, elderly, whatever. And there's the track record at the bottom for the 3 leading journals. That's the Journal of the American Planning Association. In 11 years, only had 3 articles, and I think 1 or 2 of them were by members of your faculty. The Journal of Planning Education, I'm not saying that's bad. Well, I'm saying the number is bad, not who contributed. The Journal of Planning Education and Research, 0. The Journal of Planning Literature, 0. And since then, since 2000, there have been 1 or 2 more articles in these journals, and that's it. And you know what some of those articles were about in those journals? They were about migration patterns. They were about low-cost housing. They were not really directly about the elderly, but they touched on some of those issues. For example, here's some ways in which, well, one of the overarching things that I see is that when these articles touch on older folks, they touch upon them as poor, disadvantaged problems, okay? And only as poor. They don't address the issues, for example, in housing, that older people are overhoused. That is, they're living in houses too big for them and they can't move out. Frequently you hear people say, oh, the elderly are rich. They're living in a $300,000 house. But if they sold their $300,000 house, where could they go? Idaho? I mean, if they want to live in their community in most cities, they can only buy another 2,000 square foot house for, well, maybe 300,000 is way low for Portland, but you know what I mean. In their neighborhoods, they don't have a lot of other choices. The housing stock they have may be falling apart. They were middle class, but keeping, as their medical expenses and other things go up, they can't keep their houses up. Their neighborhoods don't meet their needs. The pedestrian facilities, maybe they don't even have sidewalks. If they have sidewalks, maybe nobody maintains them. They don't keep parked cars in driveways for blocking sidewalks. They don't have adequate lighting. They don't do enforcement. And the whole issue of transportation, most of the literature in the planning literature that focuses on older folks acts like they're not drivers. Now, of course, the problems of people who are not drivers are important, but people who drive also have problems that planners need to do. Again, this could be a subject of several hours worth of discussion, but I want to point out in some of the ways that this particular area, smart growth, often neglects, it doesn't have to, there's nothing inherently anti-elderly about smart growth, but it is, and the proposals that come with it, but there's nothing inherently focused on the needs of the elderly as well. First of all, and this is a criticism that's been made against smart growth and neo-traditionalists anyway, they don't focus on the suburbs. And most of the older people are living in existing suburbs, so it hardly makes any difference what you're doing out in green fields because it doesn't address the needs of most of the older folks. If you are talking about greenfield development, there's very little discussion at all about these active adult communities that I showed you in Tucson that are growing everywhere. No one is talking about requiring special facilities there. The developers indeed offer some special facilities, but not enough. They don't offer public transportation. Often they don't put in sidewalks. They think you're going to go to a rec center. You're going to drive to the rec center and do exercise. You're not going to walk in the community. I have some pictures that I'm not going to share with you today of some of the communities that have won awards for their neo-traditional development or the contribution to smart growth, where it would be very easy for an older person who was walking in front of these zero lot line houses to be hit by a car if someone was driving too rapidly. The whole issue of safety and security, where safety means crashes and security means fear of crime. The whole issue of housing, one of the things that older people who are living in these houses need is some financial help getting them retrofitted. That is bathrooms, showers they can get into, toilets they can use. None of this is happening in the planning community. Big issue that the elderly themselves report frequently is the whole question of enforcement. People are driving around suburban streets too fast. Kids love speed bumps. Have you noticed that? Those teenagers love to go over the speed bumps too fast and have the sparks fly. They're not nearly as self-enforcing as people think they are. So a whole issue is the enforcement of speed limits and the enforcement of parking so cars don't block the pedestrian facilities. One of the interesting things, so many of the current proposals for densifying cities talk about active street life, interesting things going on in the street, activities. I just came back from Europe I'm a commentator on a European Community 7-country study of older people. And they asked older people to talk about their problems. Now, these are people living in Vienna and Stockholm. These are people living in some of the kinds of cities we think we want to emulate in the United States. One of their largest complaints was cyclists. Cyclists don't respect them as pedestrians. Cyclists get in their way. Another major complaint was that the sidewalks weren't maintained. Sidewalks were too busy, there was too much street life, there was too much activity. All the things we're trying to create here, older people are complaining about as major, major problems. They complain far more about cyclists in Europe than they do about car drivers. They complain far more about noise and congestion and unfamiliar people and strange street furniture than they do about the fact that about the other issues that you would think might engage them. So these are kinds of issues that need to be addressed and are not. And I think there's three major reasons why planners and to a lesser extent civil engineers don't make these mistakes. They believe some myths about the elderly. They accept the social worker's view of the elderly, and I know I'm going to get criticized for that, but okay, that's what we should be doing. We should be having a discussion about this. And they buy into the fallacy of composition, and let me talk about that, about the biggest myths. Certainly, I've addressed the first one. I think I may have, if not convinced you, made you think about the contribution older people make to all of the issues planners and civil engineers care about: pollution, congestion, sprawl, all of these things the elderly are a major part of. Second view is, and there's a lot of literature about this, that people see the elderly as either rich or poor, either able-bodied or handicapped, either in need of help or in need of no help. And in fact, most older people fall somewhere along that spectrum. It is indeed true that elderly people today have higher incomes, are better educated, are more likely to own their houses, etc., than older people in the past. But just because you come into your retirement years with sufficient income doesn't mean that 20 years later you have enough money to live on. Just because you can drive when you're 65 doesn't mean you're going to be able to drive when you're 80. There are all sorts of problems that older people face as they age, even though they're not totally disadvantaged, or they are not poor, or they are not totally physically disabled. And the third one is the sort of social worker view that if all older people are so disabled and are so disadvantaged, there's nothing planners or civil engineers could do for them. They need case management. They need the kind of one-to-one attention that social workers give. And I think that's a myth. Moreover, planners and civil engineers are divided from folks who work with older people by a bunch of things. First of all is a language difference. What does access mean to somebody? Well, I want any gerontologist to answer. What does access mean to a planner? Doesn't it mean your ability to get somewhere, or maybe to get on a bus? It has either that physical, it has a physical component. Often in the human services community, access means that you are eligible to receive a service and or that it exists. Totally different meaning. How about mobility? What does a planner mean by mobility? Exactly. What do you think gerontologists or social workers? They often mean your ability to move around in your apartment, to actually stand up, to go to the bath, be able to use the bathroom in your own facility. Totally different meaning. I mean, they're related, obviously, but the fact that they're related actually makes it worse, not better, because we think we're using the same words. It's the trouble I have every time I go to Europe, and they all speak English, but they don't. It's that European, and the words don't mean the same thing, and I get very confused. In fact, somebody said they do well, the Swedes and the Dutch and the Danes, and they all do well speaking to each other in English, but when an English speaker, native English speaker shows up, that's when the problems start. Partially it's the accent, but it's very different use of language, and I think that that's not uncommon for disciplines to use language differently. But when we're talking about these issues, the fact that we use the language differently is a problem. Folks in the human services and social work community tend to have a case management view of a person. They want to deal with all of their needs, but they want to deal with it on a personal level. If you read, as I unfortunately did, all of these articles in the 28 journals on gerontology, There is no questioning whatsoever of the built environment. It's all taken as given, as a barrier, but as given. Those folks who deal with older people who are very disadvantaged don't have the time to consider the larger issues, so they focus in very narrowly. That's not wrong for the people involved, but in fact, since most older people don't fall into that group, it's a problem. It's a problem for planners to work with gerontologists because of that difference in focus. And the whole idea that when older folks don't use services, it's something sort of outside the control of the service. For example, if older people don't use medical facilities or don't go to congregate meals, the judgment in the social and human service community is that there's something, it's not the service, it's something about the community that's preventing the person from using it. And there's some evidence that's not true. Oh, sorry about that. Last, if everybody you see is very disadvantaged, if all the elderly people you see are very handicapped, poor, and have a lot of problems, then you think that all elderly people are very poor or have problems. And that, in fact, is not true. Let me jump ahead a minute, because actually I don't know, Jennifer, how long am I going over? Oh, no, you're fine. Okay. Let me come back to those, and I'm looking for something else. Okay. This is in my special area of transportation. I think that this is the way the problems are viewed, but I think it's true of every urban problem. Housing, community development, the kinds of issues that planners and engineers and gerontologists ought to be working together on. On the left-hand side are people with no problems. They have no disabilities, they have no financial problems, they have no physical issues, they have no emotional problems. And we assume that they and their families and the market will handle that. And after all, they have no problems, so they can buy what they need, they have no issues. On the right side, we see people, older people have significant disabilities. They have financial problems, they have physical problems, they have emotional problems, they have mental problems, and we the public sector, have to intervene. This, I think, is the common perception of most of the issues with which the elderly deal, that there's either people with nothing wrong with them or people with a lot wrong with them. The people who have nothing wrong with them, we let the private market and their family take care of them. That's not an issue. Take care of them. They don't need to be taken care of, right? On the other side are people with extreme disabilities, and we got to rush in. There's very few areas where the general conception is that there are mixed models, very few. But in fact, I think this is what reality is. And it's not one-directional. People, particularly older people, move back and forth. They have a stroke, and then they get better, and they recover. They have a stroke, they stop driving, they get better, they start driving again. On some days they need walkers. On some days they don't. On other days they don't. On some days they feel well enough to drive. And in fact, older people often pack a lot of activities into one day to drive for that trip. And another day they don't feel well enough to drive, and they don't go out at all, or they take special transportation or whatever the options are. The implications for me of this are that there are private market solutions, and there are people who don't need to be considered at all, and there are people on the other end who need one-to-one case management, and they are not the purview of civil engineers or planners. But there's a huge group in the middle who live their lives daily, but their communities are not right for them, increasingly not right for them. They don't offer the pedestrian facilities, they don't make it easy for them to continue driving, they don't deal with any of the human service and problems in human service delivery. And those are the areas where we have to forge a set of relationships. One, there has to be a lot of interaction and cooperation between the public and private sector. You know, the private sector is slipping in all the time. In all the misconceptions in all the areas where the public sector, and particularly planners, are not responding, there's a lot of market solutions. My father lived in assisted living until he passed last year. And sometimes I'd come to visit him, and there'd be a big black Buick in front of his place. And a guy in a very shiny black suit would get out, an unmarked black Buick would get out. He'd go in and he'd escort 3 or 4 older ladies into the car and seat them and drive away. And so I asked at the desk, who is he? Well, they said, oh, he's the taxi driver. Well, there's no meter in his cab, and he's a guy who decided there was money in taking older ladies where they wanted to go. And how he got known to them was by word of mouth, and then everybody passes along his cell number to everybody else. And whether he's legal or not, what he's doing is probably not legal, but he's clearly filling a market niche that he found for himself. And I think that's happening more and more. The market sees that older people are not on either extreme, that there are people who have some money but need some help. There's people who can live in the community but need some changes in their house or the community structure, the kinds of things that planners address. So we need some cooperation between the public and the private sector, and we also need cooperation across disciplines. Gerontologists, planners, social workers, civil engineers have to meet on a more common ground. It also means to me that we can't have, I don't mean to pick on anybody, but I don't think it's very useful to have a separate section of a transportation plan or a community development plan or a comprehensive plan focused on the elderly or people with disabilities. I think, because of the argument I've been making that the elderly are part of our problems and need comprehensive community solutions, that if your city has a comprehensive plan, the housing element should have a list of things, and of that list of things that should be promoted or planned for or hoped for or funding sought for, there should be elderly housing, infill and retrofit programs and loan programs to restore your house. There should be visitability ordinances. Do you know what visitability is? I'll come back to that in a minute. Under transportation, there shouldn't, all of the things, the improvements to intersections, etc., there should be the improvements we need to make it easier for elderly drivers to drive safely longer. There should be, under the land use, we should be talking about mixed land use and infill. We should be talking about, our comprehensive plan should be talking about what active adult retirement communities ought to be doing differently as they locate at the edge. We should be doing things in our housing component and land use components about encouraging active adult communities to move into the cities where the existing services are. Under the transportation components, each of the components of our comprehensive plans or our plans should have in them the kinds of things that help older people as they have the kinds of things that help younger people. This should be a central thing, a central theme of each of the components of the comprehensive plan or of the planning process. My students often get hired by an MPO, a Metropolitan Planning Organization, or some organization to be the elderly planner. So you've got this giant planning process that goes on, totally ignoring the needs of older people and of other people too, people with disabilities. And then my young student who just graduated gets to write the component about the elderly, about people with disabilities, about Latvian immigrants with one toe. You know, everything that's marginal gets stuck in this little chapter, stuck on the end. Has nothing to do with the entire process, has nothing to do with the components of the process, has nothing to do with the implementation. We have to stop thinking about older people as marginal. Indeed, there are older people who are very disadvantaged who need, but the majority of older people are us. They're people like everyone else, and planners and civil engineers have to incorporate those kinds of things into every aspect of the planning process. Let me come back for a minute to visitability. It's visitability. We know that older people will not buy houses. If you buy a house when you're 60 or 65 when you retire, we know you will not buy a house with wider shower doors, with grab bars. You won't do it. And houses that have been modified for people with disabilities are a drag on the market. Sometimes if you want to sell your house, if you modified your house for your mother or your mother-in-law and you want to sell it, sometimes you have to take those things out. They actually cause the price to drop. And if you want to advertise to older people, what do? You get a 40-year-old model to say, retirement's so lovely for me. Well, hell, she's 40 years old. Of course it's lovely for her. But older people Older people in general refuse to see themselves that way. They see themselves as 20 or 25 years younger, so you have to advertise to them that way. They don't want to see that they may need grab bars in the toilet or the shower. You can't sell it to them. So what do? You say your all new houses must be built so that people who use walkers, people who use wheelchairs can come visit you. And people go, oh, sure, because everybody knows a veteran or somebody with a mother-in-law who uses a wheelchair. Everybody knows somebody who needs those kind of facilities. And so it's not for, I'm 60, 70 years old, I'm buying a house. Oh, no, none of those are for me. It's for Aunt Margaret. It's for Cousin Joey. And there are a number of cities that are adopting visitability ordinances. And I'd like to see that expanded. I'd like to see retrofit programs. Those should be part of our plans. How to retrofit houses, how to find ways to make communities respond without, in fact, coming up against people's prejudice, their ageism. And some people have said, there's a lot of sexism in this because a lot of older people are women. So already that's a double whammy. In our society we don't value older people, and in our society we value women less than other people, so we value old women, who are the majority of older people, less. So let me say, in conclusion, and then we can have some questions. There's lots of areas where, let's see if I can find some of those. There's lots of areas where planners and civil engineers ought to be incorporating concerns about older people. All kinds of issues, whether we allow cars to park over pedestrian facilities so older people have to go into the street to walk or have to go in the street to pick up a bus, whether there's actually an accessible path. How many people think the ADA requires accessible sidewalks? If you have sidewalks, they have to be accessible. It doesn't require you to put them in. So we have this ridiculous phenomena where you have to have accessible bus stops, but you don't have to have an accessible path to the bus stop. Now, you should know that there is a very interesting case decided last year in the Ninth Circuit Court, which, as we all know, includes you, and is the most liberal court in the country, and they ruled that that was the most absurd interpretation of the ADA they had ever heard. So if somebody sues in the 9 states that are in that circuit court, or 7 states that are in the Ninth Circuit, they can force cities, as Sacramento was forced, to put in sidewalks. But what you've got across the country, I have a wonderful repertoire of pictures of gorgeous accessible bus stops in the middle of dirt lots. We can't have this. That's the kind of thing that city planners and the civil engineers with whom they work need to deal with, and they need to do that in coordination with gerontologists and social workers and people in the human service community. So I'm going to stop there. And I gather there might be questions online. And how do we do it? Do we take the in-house questions first, or?
And I'm going to remind everyone to use the microphone if you have one to ask your question.
How about the lady in purple? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you the question. I do this both as a profession, as a planner, but also I'm a daughter who has a mother who's 83, and so I am looking at some of the issues both on a personal and professional level, and kind of trying to come up with a solution that's both cost effective as well as meeting a need that I see for my own mom. One of the things that is interesting to me in working on the transportation side of things is what I hear often social workers, when I'm working with them, or social service agencies say, because I often use my mom as an example, is that my mom is unique. She's mobile, she is outgoing, she goes visiting, she uses the bus, she uses her car, blah, 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 blah. And that, and my mom, about 5 years ago, she's, like I said, she's 83, maybe it was more like 10, she moved from the suburbs to the inner city to be closer to where I live. And that apparently, in sort of the whole concept of aging in place, is something that she shouldn't have wanted to do, or she wouldn't sort of be interested in doing. And I guess I have I guess the way I see the elderly, and that my mom being one of them, is sort of a progressive person, or at least a person who's had more experience in life than what I'm hearing from some of the social service agencies, is that maybe the whole aging in place is maybe not, within the next 10 or 15 years, won't be such
No,
an
I
important
think
factor.
there's a bunch of things happening there. One is the issue of what social service agencies are saying about your mom being unique. I think that's not true at all. I think it's the other way around. I think social service agencies in general, by definition, deal with the most needy, and it's the fallacy of composition. Because they deal with people who have no children, who have terrible problems, they think that all older people have that. And of course they want more funding for people who have needs. There's not enough money. There's no doubt about that. But I think that my solution to that is if we had broader solutions for people starting at 65, then there wouldn't be so many people who were totally disadvantaged, and there would be more money because we'd be bringing in private sector money. So I think one is it's the fallacy of composition. The people they see are very, very disadvantaged, and so that's the issues they want to address, and that's how they see older people. I think older people are a spectrum, and they have issues, and the issues often, not always, often get worse as they get older. The second thing is that, in fact, people do move to be near their children, and when I say older people age in place, often there's a move at the end, and it's to a nursing home or assisted living, or it's to the children or near the children. Well, where are the children living? You live in the inner city, but nationally, and even in Portland, my guess is that most people live in the suburbs. So what happens is that most people either move near their kids, or they move into they either move in assisted living or nursing homes near where they live, or they move into assisted living or nursing homes near where their kids live. And their kids tend to live in the suburbs. So you get some movement of people from the central city to the suburbs when they retire, even though most people do age in place. So what's unique, I think, about your case is not that your mother is young and active. What's unique about your case is that your mother moved to the inner city from the suburb, which is not what most people are doing. And I think aging in place is the major issue. How about that gentleman in the back?
You mentioned cities that are instituting visitability ordinances, and I'm wondering which cities are those and what's happened. How's that process taken place?
It's the county around Tucson, not the city of Tucson, and there's several, and I'm sorry, off the top of my head I don't remember, there's several suburban communities around Chicago, and the people you should contact are, I'll remember. As I'm talking, I'll remember who you should contact. There are people who are following this. There's a firm that has something about technology, a nonprofit, something about technology in its title in Chicago that's promoting visitability.
It's the Center for Neighborhood Technology?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. It's the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and the person is...
They're in Chicago.
Yeah, and they're big promoters of visitability. It tends to be smaller communities, and you should know developers are against it. Developers of new housing say, oh my God, it costs $3,000 more, and maybe it does. But if it were more widespread, then you could walk into Home Depot and buy doors that were wider and shower bars. You know, if it were institutionalized, the price of any of those additions would come way, way down. There's another lady in the back. Let me get her.
Do you have any encouraging examples of co-housing or intergenerational models that might be out there?
I don't study housing per se. There's a lot of literature on co-housing. I confess I don't know much about it. What I do know is that zoning regulations usually work against co-housing, and that's another feature that planners ought to be looking at. That is, zoning ordinances often say they're based on the family definition, so they often say that only a family can live in a house. So if you're an older person and you have this big house and you don't want to move, and people really don't want to move, they want to stay in the neighborhood that they lived in, it is generally illegal for you to rent to somebody else by your zoning or building code ordinances. So even though I don't know much about co-housing, I know that there are barriers to it that planners ought to address. Sir. Oh, yeah, when you ask a question, you're supposed to hold the button down, and I'm getting a notice here that some of you are not. So.
It seems like a lot of older folks make up, or they tend to be voters. And I'm curious as to whether an organization like ARP or even...
They hate ARP. You're supposed to say AARP.
ARP. Sorry. That's what it says on my folks' magazines I start getting now. Is there... And there's certainly a lot of talk about like drugs for like pharmaceuticals for senior citizens. Those issues always seem to be in the news. I was wondering if there's, since they do make up a large, or they do tend to vote, if there's some sort of political pressure they're able to exert even
well, they're
on
not,
the city level.
I've worked with AARP for a long time. They're not particularly concerned with about 2/3 of these issues. They've just come out with a report on livable communities. I can't remember the title. But because they've refused to be part of the Smart Growth Coalition, they haven't done much on that. And they focus mostly on Medicare and drugs and drug stuff. They're not, it's very hard to get them interested in transportation issues. I have not been, no one's been successful. They're not a big player in this area, and they could be.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. I'm chair of one of the neighborhood associations in Portland, and one of the things I've found most interesting about it, certainly when I go to the board meetings, is I'm about half as young as everybody else there, which is really interesting. But while there's plenty of issues that come up, pedestrian and other things, it doesn't seem like any of the older folks that I get to work with really talk about issues specific to elderly people. And I'm wondering, since these are the people that are actually taking time out to volunteer in the community, do they just not know?
There's two things going on. There's always the problem. Irving Rostow, years ago, a gerontologist, said the problems of older people are of two types: those they really have and those the experts think they have. And I've seen a number of studies, one done in Tucson, but I've seen this a dozen times, where they have focus groups with organizations that deal with the elderly, and they have focus groups with the elderly. And then they list their problems. And they're as different as night and day. And they're as different as night and day, not because the professionals are wrong, but because they're talking about the people with whom they deal. They're talking about very sick, very disadvantaged, very needy people. The older folks who show up to focus groups, who drove themselves to focus groups, what are they complaining about? Drivers who drive too fast, stoplights that are not long enough. They have a whole different set of issues. So they're different people. And the second thing that's going on is that we absolutely refuse to see ourselves as older. So when we're young and active, we just absolutely cannot see that sometime we may need help. And somebody said earlier, you were talking about your problems as an adult child of an older person. I think the opportunity here is, one, to see that older people contribute to social problems, and two, for those of us who have spent time being caretakers, who have had to change aspects of our lives, of our driving, of our work hours, of our all sorts of things to take care of older parents. And men are starting to do it too. Women have done this for generations. But now that men are starting to have to make trips to distant cities to take care of older parents and all of these things, that we can aim at adult children of older people and say, oh, not for you, but for your older mother. She can't walk in her neighborhood. Her house is not right. Wouldn't it be better if we had housing legislation and housing programs that helped her? And we don't say, 20 years from now or 15 years from now, you could use that house, because that doesn't work, because they still see themselves as the 40-year-old model. So I think that what you're saying is exactly true. So you don't pitch if you want to make these changes, you don't pitch to people, help yourself. You pitch to people, help your parents, help somebody else who has a disability. No, it's not for you. So I think that what you're saying really reinforces what we see in study after study. Older people who are out and involved and active don't see that they're ever going to be any other way. How about this gentleman? Jim.
How do you think the transit industry should respond to these future mobility needs? Does it mean more paratransit, or is there a fixed
You got
route?
about 5 hours?
Well, just 5
Okay,
minutes.
real fast. One, they should improve the vehicles they use. Only about 11% of the bus fleet in this country are low-floor buses. They all have wheelchairs on them, but what does that do for most people? It does nothing. So we need to improve the vehicle. Older people say they want better pre-trip and en route information. So in other words, if they're transferring to a bus, they get information en route that when they're at their destination, they want to come home, they get better information. We need to talk about both security and safety. Older people are both scared to walk to buses, scared to wait at bus stops, and they're frightened to be on the bus. You know? The driver starts before you do. You can fall on the bus. You can be jostled. Older people are fearful of not getting to the exit in time. They're fearful, especially on mid-door or rear-door buses. They're scared that the driver is going to take off while they're still getting off. We have to have better driver training. We have to have new routing. Most buses go where the cows used to go. And most routing in major transit systems is screwy anyway. But even if it isn't, even if it's going to major employment concentrations, older people are not going to major employment concentrations. So we have to be talking about some rerouting of buses, maybe special services. Some services, buses I'm talking about, that only run 2 or 3 days a week or run shopper specials have been very successful in communities. If you know the bus goes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to 3 different grocery stores, 2 things happen. 1, older people use them. And 2, you can get money out of the grocery stores to help pay for the buses. So I'm talking about traditional buses, not paratransit. What we need to do, of course, is expand paratransit, but it's so damn expensive. We need to try to find ways to provide. And paratransit means, and I've heard this from older people, they have to call up. First of all, they have to get certified. Then they have to call up. They have to say where they are and when they have to go. They have to give all their details. You don't, when you get on a regular city bus, you say, "Excuse me, driver, my social security number is," and I'm going to. You don't have to tell people your business when you get on a bus. And a lot of older people are annoyed by the whole thing about paratransit. So of course there are people who are always going to need paratransit, but we should be trying to find more conventional transportation options. I work a lot in developed countries. I work in Britain, I work in France, I work in the Netherlands and Scandinavia, Australia, and all of those countries, car drivers, older car drivers use traditional, conventional transportation much more than any folks here do. In fact, if you look at the data and you pull up, and I think I showed you something, if you pull up car drivers, their transit use is practically zero of people over 65. If you do that in Australia or Britain or France, it's a much higher transit usage because, of course, the cities are different, but we can still talk about the services are different. There are different ways for folks to use it. So we have to be looking at what I call a family of services. And we have to reserve very expensive paratransit door-to-door. We have to reserve that for people who really need that level of service. But lots of older people don't, and we ought to be providing them with the kinds of public transportation services that they pay their taxes for that meet their needs. We also need to be developing paratransit options in the private community, better uses of, and you have a really good example in Portland. You have more accessible taxi cabs in Portland than in any other city in the country. We need to be building private entrepreneurs, helping, especially in communities of color where they work really well. We need to be developing those kind of people who want to provide those services, making it possible for them to do it. Without subsidy, it can be done. Or we can subsidize those kinds of services which are a lot cheaper than either public paratransit or even public transit service. So that was a 5-hour answer in 10 minutes. Let's see, I'm trying to think. Okay, how about this young man with the hat?
Considering the numbers of aging population, it was pretty shocking to learn that there's only been a handful of published planning articles on this topic, and especially considering that you've outlined quite a few research ideas here, and there's probably 5 articles that could be published up on the board right there.
Yeah,
so my questions are, first, of the couple articles that have been published by non-Portland State faculty, were they all by you? And
I'm sorry, I was laughing, so I didn't hear the end of the question.
of the two that were published by non-Portland State faculty, were they both by you?
No,
and
actually,
more importantly,
one was.
is this lack of articles due to you and others in the field not submitting research papers, or because the reviewers at JAPA and other planning publications are sort of turning their shoulder on this
That's
issue?
a good question. Well, it's hard for me to know what the journals are doing, but my guess is that they're not rejecting them. My guess is that I'm pretty active in the organization of planning professors, and I know a lot about what people are doing, and I just don't think this is considered a legitimate or important topic. It's considered a subset of equity. So if you're an equity planner or a social planner, one little part of what you do might be concerned with the elderly, which is crazy when you look at the demographics. You notice I didn't argue any of this as equity or social welfare. I argued it as good planning practice. If 1 out of 4 of your citizens is over 65, you should be doing it. I don't know. Those of us who do this sit around and talk about why no one is doing this. We talk about why we can't get young people to do master's theses or doctoral dissertations in planning or civil engineering about this. We can't. I don't know. I think some of it is pervasive ageism. We see the aged as outside of society, as weak, as powerless, which is really stupid because they have a lot of money and they have a lot of power. I think some of it is sexism because so many of the elderly are older. But isn't it funny, because planners are often drawn to marginalized groups, and yet this is a very marginalized group that planners are not drawn to. I'm not sure I have any good explanations. Let's see. The lady in the back.
You've said that the crashes related to elderly people are relatively lower.
I'm sorry.
You've said that crashes involving elderly are relatively lower, elderly drivers.
On a per capita basis.
Yeah, but there are a lot of concerns from the elderly folks about their safety in general, about traffic, and what are the things that they are concerned of, and what should planners do to...
There's a lot of uniformity across countries. A lot of my colleagues who do this kind of work in Europe get the same thing out of their focus groups. They're concerned about other drivers a lot. Other drivers tailgating them because they're going too slowly, but when often they're going the speed limit. Too slowly means they're going the speed limit. They talk about other drivers being rude and aggressive traffic behavior, and they ask for police enforcement. So that's not necessarily a planning issue, but it's an issue. They talk about cyclists doing things like being up on the sidewalks. And I understand why where you don't have good cycling facilities, why the cyclists go on the sidewalk, but hey, there is a conflict between cyclists and pedestrians. They don't ask for things for themselves, which I think planners need to be talking about. They complain about signs and they complain about marking, but they don't know enough, unless they're engineers or they're professionally trained that way, to know that the Federal Highway Administration and NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, have come up with roadway standards for older drivers. Better marking, better signs, the huge manuals which are voluntary. So older people don't know about that. There are retraining courses, in-car retraining courses, but elderly people, when you say that to them, they don't think that would help them in general. Some do, some older women do, but it's not very uniform. So what you've got is another divide between what older people think they need and what experts think they need. And when I'm in the group of experts, I think I'm right. I think that in-car training would help older drivers. I don't think there's no evidence that any of those AARP is going to put out a hit contract on me, but there's no evidence that in-classroom training improves your safety, and there's some evidence it causes more crashes because it makes you more confident than you should be. Yeah, there's some real problems. So there's a bunch of things that are on the table that we need to test out to see if they work. Okay, the gentleman right there.
Spent some time talking about the environmental effects of the car, and you inferred that rising VMT, et cetera, I guess leads to these environmental effects. But one of the great environmental success stories of the last 50 years is the tremendous improvement of air quality in urban areas by any measure, in spite of rising GDP and VMT, et cetera. So, to me, that's really kind of a 1970s view. And what exactly is your concern then? Because I don't see air quality as really much.
Well,
of a
I think a
concern.
lot of people think that more cars and more VMT is bad. If you don't, good for you. But I'm surrounded by people who think it's bad and want to get anybody they can out of cars. And the easiest people to get out of cars are older women. And it's very clear that a lot of things we do, for example, mandatory relicensing at 65 or 70, discourages a lot of drivers who could, in fact, continue driving. So rather than, and those kinds of things are going on everywhere. What I would like to do is keep older drivers driving longer, and hopefully in cleaner vehicles, and hopefully in safer vehicles. One of the downsides of your success story is some of the improvement in air quality has been achieved by downsizing the vehicles, and the less metal you put around an older person, the greater risk you put them at in a crash. Which leads me to another issue, which is all that stuff that's out there, golf carts and all these sort of electric vehicles, little cart things that older people are using. We don't know how safe they are. They're not regulated. The government buys a lot of scooters for people under Medicare, and we don't know if they're safe. We don't know whether they should be on the sidewalk, whether we should require them to be in the street. There's a whole area there that the government needs to get involved in regulating them. If you're hit, some of them are only go 9 to 12 miles an hour, but if you're a pedestrian hit by one of those little carts going 9 to 12 miles an hour, you could be in serious trouble. All you have to do is knock down a person and they break their hip, and that's the end. Because then they go into hospital, then they decline. It's never called a traffic crash. It's never called a death attributable to a traffic accident, but in fact it really is. So I want to keep older people in their cars as long as possible, but I live in an environment where people are trying to take people out of cars, and I think most of us do. And in the case of the elderly, if you take them out of their cars, you're putting them more at danger on the sidewalk, the way our sidewalks are. You're putting them more in danger in walking to transit facilities, and you're really increasing their risk of severe isolation, which leads to depression, which leads to early death. There's just no doubt about that. There's a zillion studies that show that. In fact, often when I talk, somebody will get up in the audience and say, I work with older people, and I still remember that one gerontological nurse said, I believe, she said, that the leading cause of suicide among my older male patients is loss of the license. And if you think about the way our society is, when you take that license away, you're taking more than a car, and you're even taking more than mobility. You're taking a whole sense of identity. And maybe it shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it is. And increasingly it will be true of women, I believe. It will be true of my generation. If you try to take my car away, or you do take my car away, you'll kill me too. Okay. How about okay, let me take this gentleman because I pointed to him, and then you want to do the web ones. Sir.
Can you talk about any successful examples of active retirement communities that you've come across in terms of meeting these problems?
They all have pluses and minuses. One of the positive things about them is that they actually do offer recreation and encourage recreation, and they encourage a social capital. They encourage the building of neighborhood social capital so that people in these active adult retirement communities come to care for one another. Someone gets sick, someone loses the ability to drive, they bring food, they take the person to the store. They create community where there was none, and some of them are very successful at that. At the same time, they're out in the boonies, and it's impossible to bring public transportation there in any kind of a cost-effective way. They don't provide transportation. We're not talking about assisted living. We're talking about, younger, more active, older people. And it is entirely clear that most of the developers of such communities don't provide services on purpose. They don't want people with disabilities there. They don't want frail, elderly people there because it reduces the resale value of the houses. I've had them say that to me informally. If you're 60 years old and you drive into a community and you see people in wheelchairs and walkers and you're looking for a house, you turn around and drive right out. So they're a mixture. And one of the things that I think is interesting and I'd like to do research on, and somebody would fund me, is I'd like to see if we could take the positive aspects of adult retirement communities and transfer that to those aging in place communities. Can we figure out what features worked and then retrofit existing communities where the majority of older people are aging in place? Can we retrofit those attributes into the community so those folks can enjoy them? Okay, I guess we do web now, or is it too late?
We have 4 or 5 web questions, but just kind of maybe one. If you could talk a little bit anecdotally about ADA compliance in small places, but what about whole-scale sort of adoption of ADA compliance, and how would that is ADA mobility good for? Is that good for older people as well?
Well, there's 2 issues here. The Americans with Disabilities Act, in terms of transportation and facilities, is a powerful tool, and since about 40% of people with disabilities are over 65, there's a lot of assistance here. Unfortunately, in terms of, say, paratransit, there's way too much belief that the minute you lose your driver's license, you just sign up for your local ADA service. And that's not true, and it's increasingly less true because the paratransit services provided under ADA mandates are extremely expensive. Many systems have been throwing elderly people off. They've been throwing anyone who doesn't meet the very strict standards of the ADA, or they've been grandparenting them. In other words, if you're already a member, if you're already in the system, you can stay in the system, but they won't let new people on. So in terms of transportation, anybody who's, and I hear this way too much, I hear this from adult children, oh, well, if my dad stops driving, he can get the paratransit system. Just being unable to drive doesn't usually qualify you, and so I think that's a real problem. In terms of the larger issues, of course, the more accessible a community is for people in wheelchairs and with walkers, the more accessible it is for everyone, and I'm a great believer in that. And I think, I'm not sure that 10, 15 years ago I was as great a supporter of the ADA as I am now. But you can see it in the streets. You can go out and see people out and about who were not out and about 15 years ago because they can get on buses, they can get into buildings, they can go places. I'm certainly hopeful that the ADA is not amended in any way that will reduce its mandates. And in fact, I'm encouraging people to take those mandates further, such as accessible sidewalks. You can have an accessible bus stop that you can't get to. It's ludicrous. We should have access everywhere. You're going to have to cut off all those web folks. I'm sorry, web folks.
That's okay. I want to thank you very much, and I don't have more announcements because this is our final one, but I do also want to again thank the Oregon Department of Transportation for sponsoring Sandy's visit here, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.